I'm just going to play with convolution a little bit and make some tails, mostly. Just using convolution as an alternative to reverb to create. You can use it on dry sounding drum loops to get interesting tails, interesting room sensations, and the cool thing about convolution is that you can make your own impulses. So if I start with making a very simple click sound, for example, in FM8. Yeah, I have to start this off axis. This is actually one trick that someone on Twitter taught me about FM8. If you want your oscillation to start off axis, there's a way to do it. You use another operator with ratio 0 and a negative offset, and I don't know how it works, but it actually offsets the start of the waveform. So this should now be some sort of pop involved. As you can hear it starting off axis a bit. So that's pretty handy for making transients. It's going to be very short. Very silly little nonsensical little percussive sound, but if I would convolute something with that, maybe something cool will happen. You actually never know. So I'm just gonna see what happens if I just export this dry sound. And it's probably gonna sound horrible, but we'll see. So now I have that sound exported, and I can put a convoluter. I use the Melda one, a multiband convoluter. I can use it on the sound itself, which is obviously not really, that's not gonna sound cool at all, but then I can start changing the sound I started with and the other sound. Actually, hang on, I'll actually duplicate this first. Right, so, let's see. Find the impulse. So here you see the little sound that I made, and then, so now we're actually convoluting the sound with itself, which is obviously not really going to lead anywhere, but if you would change this sound, or actually if we would run some audio through it, that'd probably be smarter. Let's load up some drums. Alright. Actually, these have tails. Let's make some dry ones. Alright, these are extremely dry. Cool. So, put this thing on there. See, now this weird little impulse that I made is processing these drums. Obviously this doesn't sound right at all, but you can EQ it a little bit. And now there's like a strange, the thing about this is what it does to my ears is it makes it sound as if the sound you're putting through it is coming out of some sort of membrane that's limiting the frequencies it can produce. So even though this doesn't sound good, it does sound like an object creating this sound, playing this sound, and that can be really helpful for putting things in a place in a mix, because your ears are saying that this is one object. I guess it's very similar when people use cabinet models and stuff for guitars or putting drums through cabinet models. It's this similar kind of idea. It gets this physical sensation of coming out of a speaker, and that can really set up separation. But obviously you can also make longer sounds in here that really have a lot of tail, and so I have some impulses here. This one, for example. This one's really stereo and high passed. Probably turn off the EQ. How do I turn it off? And this was this is an impulse which is a detuned to detuned very short sounds, which so basically they create a stereo image constantly on the sound. So now the quite dry, this is almost mono. Actually, I'll make it mono just to point it out. This is completely dead mono, and now you have a stereo image, which is, if I fold it, it sounds like folding a detuned synth, because that's kind of what happens. And I've experimented with these impulses and made a whole bunch of ones, and just to see what happens. And there's lots of cool things you can do with it, because, for example, if you take this and you put a reverb on it, like a plate or something, then suddenly there's these different resonant frequencies that kind of make up the tail that weren't really, you don't really hear them in here, but because it's going through the convoluter, it creates these resonances which do sound kind of, they don't sound natural, but they do sound kind of physical. And this allows you to make like a cool little like room for your drums. So if I add dry to wet, then obviously this is not really what you want, but with just the reverb you wouldn't have gotten that weird resonance in there. Or this. These are actually chromatic. I don't know what I did exactly, but I think these impulses are all actually all the notes on the keyboard with the sine wave, so from all the way down to all the way up, so that it basically, I figured if I put a sine wave on all the keys and convolute with it, it's always going to sound somehow musical, because it's going to always resonate on an actual note and not right next to the note, because the sine wave is only playing one note. But obviously you get a really weird, you get this weird sound from it, because anyway, it sounds really metallic. But that's the sort of thing that you figure out once you try it. So I don't actually use these all that much, but it does sometimes give nice results. And another great thing for tails, drum tails, is using a frequency shifter, because when you're working with transients, you want to be careful with your phase, and frequency shifters will mess with your phase, because they're not, they don't reset. It's basically a running oscillator, as far as I know. But if you sidechain this with your drums, then there's not really a problem. But so like this, you can get like a strange metallic sort of transient. Obviously the low end sounds a bit shitty, so you cut that off first. So that's kind of like an interesting tail for the snare there, but you can go further and make much more of a effect sound with maybe we'll use this little click. So put more of a drastic sound on there. Maybe even, let's see what we have. Like this is really nice as well. Like just an oxygen valve recording. I've just been putting these weird sounds in there, and you get like these effect sounds from effect sound libraries. If you convolute with them, you can get. I mean, this sounds really breathy now. I'll take the plate off for a second. So, and that's really cool for getting things to sound physical. The only problem you get is there's this loss of frequencies when you convolute. I don't really know how it works technically, but I feel like it's like masking one sound with the other, so there's always a loss. You always lose definition in the high end. If you put two sounds at high end and convolute them, you'll always lose a certain definition because of the masking, I think. So it is sometimes difficult to get it to sound up front. It will always push it into some sort of space or some sort of physical membrane sort of sound. So because of that, it's actually quite cool to try to make cymbal sounds out of noise, because if you use two different noises and convolute them, you get these resonances, you get this masking, and it kind of becomes a cymbal. I think I'll have to actually make that. But let's make just some simple white noise. Let's silence. That should work. Yeah, that's white noise. Right, so now I think if I export this as an impulse, and if I now put the convoluter on there and find the sound. Actually, that doesn't sound very good. Maybe this should be a bit longer then. But it does not sound like just noise. It sounds more real than noise. I guess maybe if I high pass it, it'll sound a bit more like a cymbal. I guess not. Well, I mean, this, even though it's subtle, this sounds much more like a hi-hat than this, because of the resonances. And obviously this was just literally white noise on white noise, so there's way more you can do with that. But I thought that was quite a cool technique for getting kind of these overheads nicely ringing and nicely wide noisy hats and cymbals. And yeah, I think, what else can you do with convolution? Well, a lot more. The only thing that doesn't really work is putting sounds through there, using sounds that have a lot of bass, because if you convolute with them, it'll just distort because there'll be so much bass. And yeah, but it's an interesting thing. And there's, for example, making just little pops, like maybe 5 or 6 little clicks, and putting them in a sequence, very short sequence. Convoluting with that will create like a funny delay, and you can basically like kind of make your own reverb or delay or effect. And I think that's really cool for doing sound design.